When people hear the word survive, they imagine strength. They imagine resilience, control, endurance. But surviving a spiritual awakening has nothing to do with being strong. It has everything to do with being honest. Most people don't break during awakening. They bargain. They feel the discomfort rising and immediately start negotiating with themselves. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I need a new routine. Maybe I should just push through this. And slowly, quietly, they begin to patch the cracks. They return to the same roles, the same dynamics, the same ways of disappearing inside productivity, relationships, or spiritual ideas that sound good, but change nothing. That's what not surviving looks like. Not collapse. Retreat. To survive awakening doesn't mean you feel better quickly. It means you refuse to lie to yourself just to feel comfortable again. It means you allow the old identity to stay broken long enough for something true to emerge. Because the psyche doesn't collapse randomly. It collapses when the story you're living no longer matches who you are. And here's the part most people misunderstand. You can function and still be deeply misaligned. You can smile, perform, succeed, and still be betraying your own nervous system. That's why so many people go back to normal after awakening symptoms. They didn't heal. They reattached to the familiar. Carl Jung warned about this exact moment. He said that when the unconscious begins to surface, the ego will do anything to regain control, even if that means pretending nothing happened. And that's why only a small percentage makes it through. Because surviving awakening means staying present while certainty dissolves. It means tolerating the in-between. Not who you were. Not yet who you'll become. Just here. Most people can't stand that space. They rush to define themselves again. New labels. New beliefs. New explanations. But the 3% do something radically different. They slow down. They listen. They allow the discomfort to teach them instead of silencing it. And that's where the real separation begins. Because once you understand what surviving actually means, you realize the next stage isn't about spirituality at all. It's about what happens when your inner world stops supporting the life you're living. And that's where almost everyone reaches the breaking point. If you want to understand spiritual awakening without getting lost in vague language, Jung gives you a map. Not a mystical map. A psychological one. Because what most people call awakening is often the beginning of a collision. A collision between who you learn to be and who you actually are. Jung would start here. The persona. The persona is the version of you the world recognizes. The one that works. The one that's acceptable. The one that keeps life stable. It's not fake. It's functional. It's the I'm fine. The I can handle it. The I don't need anyone. The I'm the strong one. And for a while, the persona feels like you. Until one day, it doesn't. Then awakening begins. Because when the persona cracks, something rises from underneath it. Jung called it the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It's everything you had to push away to be loved, safe, or successful. Your anger, if you were taught to be nice. Your need, if you were taught to be independent. Your sensitivity, if you were taught to be tough. Your grief, if you were taught to move on quickly. The shadow is the part of you that was exiled. And when awakening starts, that exile ends. Not gently. The shadow comes back like a force. It comes back as reactions you don't recognize. Feelings you can't control. Triggers that don't match the situation. A sudden disgust for what you used to tolerate. And that's where people panic. They think, I'm getting worse. But Jung would say, no, you're becoming conscious. Because consciousness doesn't expand by collecting positive thoughts. It expands by confronting what you've avoided. And here's the part that changes everything. Above the persona and the shadow, Jung described something deeper. The self. Not the ego. Not the personality. Not the improved version of you. The self is the center of wholeness. The part of you that knows what your life is supposed to become, even when you don't. An awakening, in Jung's language, is the moment the self begins pulling you toward truth, while the ego is still trying to hold the old story together. That's why awakening feels like contradiction. You want to grow, but you want to go back. You want truth, but you want comfort. You want freedom, but you fear what it will cost. And this creates the most dangerous moment in the entire process. Because once the self starts calling you forward, your old identity starts fighting for survival. Not because it's evil, because it's terrified. And this is exactly where most people don't survive. Not because they lack spirituality, but because they hit the stage where the persona collapses, the shadow rises, and the self stays silent long enough for you to feel like you're falling. That stage has a name, a threshold, and what happens inside that threshold decides everything. There is a stage in awakening that almost no one talks about honestly, because it doesn't feel spiritual, it doesn't feel meaningful, and it definitely doesn't feel enlightened. Jung referred to this moment as the crossing point, the space between identities. And when you enter it, something strange happens. Life doesn't collapse all at once. It thins. Your old motivations stop pulling you forward. Your routines feel hollow. Your relationships start to feel off. Not wrong, just misaligned. You still show up. You still function. But inside, there's a quiet disorientation. A sense that you're living a life that no longer fits your nervous system. This is the threshold, the place where the persona no longer works. But the self hasn't fully taken the lead yet. And for most people, this is unbearable. Because the threshold removes certainty without offering answers. You don't know who you are becoming. You don't know what needs to change. You only know that going back feels false. And moving forward feels terrifying. This is when the psyche sends its strongest signals. Anxiety that doesn't respond to logic. Exhaustion that rest doesn't fix. A sudden intolerance for superficial conversations. A deep grief that has no clear story attached to it. And the mind panics. It wants a diagnosis, a label, a quick explanation, something to end the discomfort. But the threshold isn't a problem to solve. It's a passage to endure. Jung warned that when consciousness expands faster than the ego can reorganize, people will do anything to restore control. They numb. They distract. They spiritualize the pain away. Or they convince themselves that the awakening was just a phase. And this is where the 97% retreat. Not because they are weak, but because the threshold demands something most people were never taught. To stay present without certainty. To allow identity to dissolve without rushing to replace it. To tolerate the discomfort of not knowing who you are. Yet, the threshold doesn't reward effort. It tests honesty. And here's the hardest truth. If you try to escape this stage, you don't go forward. You go in circles. You repeat patterns. You attract the same dynamics. You keep awakening at the same point, over and over again, until you either turn toward the discomfort, or decide that truth costs too much. And this is where the story splits. Because what most people do next explains why only a small percentage makes it through. In the next part, I'll show you the exact psychological reasons people retreat at this stage, the hidden mistakes that turn awakening into collapse, and why recognizing them early can change the entire trajectory of your life. When people retreat from the threshold, it doesn't happen randomly. It follows a psychological pattern Carl Jung described with precision. Jung said that when the unconscious rises too quickly, the ego experiences it as a threat. Not a spiritual threat, a survival threat, because the ego's job is simple: to maintain continuity, identity, and control. So when awakening destabilizes identity, the ego activates defenses. And the first defense looks innocent. 1. Pain is danger, the ego's misinterpretation. From a Jungian perspective, pain during awakening is not pathology. It's disorientation. The ego is losing its map. But instead of reading that as transformation, it labels it as danger. So here's what happens in real life. You wake up and feel heavy for no clear reason. Your old goals don't motivate you. You feel irritated in conversations that once felt normal. Nothing is wrong. But the ego panics. It says, something is off. Fix this. Go back. So you push yourself to be productive again. You force positivity. You tell yourself to snap out of it. That's not healing. That's regression. Jung called this ego re-identification, a return to a smaller self for the sake of safety. Loop. The psyche doesn't collapse because you're weak. It collapses because the old structure can't contain what's emerging. 2. Premature healing, avoiding individuation. The second reason 97% retreat is more subtle. They confuse individuation with symptom removal. From a Jungian lens, individuation is not about feeling better. It's about becoming more aligned with the self. But the ego doesn't want alignment. It wants relief. So people rush into healing mode. They overconsume content. They search for the right label. They want an explanation that ends the process. Example: someone feels disconnected in their relationship. Instead of asking, what truth is trying to emerge? They ask, how do I feel like I used to? So they stay. They adapt. They suppress the signal. Jung warned that unresolved unconscious material doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And later, it returns stronger. Loop. What you rush to resolve, you postpone integrating. 3. Belonging over individuation. The third retreat point is one Jung considered inevitable, but decisive. The conflict between belonging and becoming. Individuation always costs belonging at some level. Not because people abandon you, but because you stop being available for roles that contradict your truth. Everyday example. You notice you're exhausted after certain interactions. You feel smaller around certain people. You sense that you're performing again. But instead of honoring that signal, you say, maybe I'm just being difficult. So you stay. You shrink. You choose the group over the self. Jung called this collective adaptation, choosing safety in the collective over fidelity to the inner voice. And this is where most awakenings quietly end. Not with collapse, with compromise. In the next part, we'll go even deeper. Because the most dangerous retreat doesn't look like fear. It looks like growth. It looks like spirituality. And it keeps people stuck for years without them realizing it. After the first retreats, something more subtle happens. The ego adapts. It doesn't fight awakening anymore. It absorbs it. And Jung warned that this stage is far more dangerous than resistance. Because now, the ego isn't trying to go back. It's trying to stay in control while pretending to transform. 4. The spiritual persona, ego wearing sacred language. Jung called this ego inflation. The ego expands by identifying with something larger than itself. Spirituality, insight, identity. In awakening, this often looks like a spiritual persona. The person no longer says, I'm confused. They say, I'm awakened. They don't say, I'm hurting. They say, I've transcended that. Everyday example. Someone starts judging others for being asleep. They feel superior for being detached. They mistake emotional numbing for enlightenment. Outwardly, they seem calm. Inwardly, they are rigid. Jung warned that when the ego identifies with the self, growth stops, because humility disappears. Loop. When spirituality becomes identity, individuation ends. 5. Ego inflation versus true self-alignment. True alignment with the self produces less certainty, not more. More listening, more patience, more restraint. But ego inflation produces conclusions. It says, I know who I am now. I'm done questioning. This is my truth. Example. Instead of changing a misaligned job or relationship, someone reframes everything spiritually. It's a lesson. It's karma. It's meant to be. Not as wisdom, but as avoidance. Jung was clear. Insight without ethical change is compensation. It balances the ego emotionally without transforming behavior. Loop. If your awareness doesn't change your choices, it's not integration. 6. Fear of the void, where most people turn back quietly. Jung described the void as the space between identities. Not depression, not emptiness, but openness without structure. And the ego fears this more than pain, because pain still gives shape. The void does not. Everyday example. Someone feels an urge to slow down, to stop forcing outcomes, to sit in silence more often. But instead, they fill every moment. Content, noise, relationships, stimulation. Not because they are distracted, but because silence threatens the ego's dominance. Jung believed that the self speaks softly, only in spaces where the ego steps back. And most people never create that space. Loop. You don't meet the self by searching. You meet it by stopping. 7. The final retreat. Insight without embodiment. This is where awakening quietly fails. The person understands everything, but lives nothing. They can explain shadow work. They can talk about ego death. They can describe awakening stages. Yet their life remains unchanged. Same boundaries, same compromises, same patterns. Jung called this neurosis of understanding, knowledge replacing transformation. And this is the final filter, because the 3% do something radically simple. They stop trying to understand themselves and start responding to what they already know. And that's where the process finally turns. In the next section, I'll show you what the 3% actually do differently. Not in theory, but in everyday life. At some point in the awakening process, something shifts. Not emotionally, not dramatically, structurally. The people who make it through don't suddenly feel enlightened. They feel grounded. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment the ego stops fighting for control and begins cooperating with the self. Not by disappearing, but by listening. And the first thing that changes isn't thought. It's the body. Instead of chasing meaning, they slow down their nervous system. They walk without distraction. They sit in silence without trying to extract insight. They reduce stimulation instead of adding new practices. They don't ask, what does this mean? They ask, can I stay with this without escaping? Because meaning doesn't arrive in chaos. It arrives when the system is stable enough to receive it. And slowly, something else becomes clear. There are truths they already know, conversations that drain them, dynamics that feel dishonest, choices that no longer align. Most people keep negotiating with those truths. The ones who make it through stop bargaining. They begin making small, quiet decisions that honor what they feel, without needing to justify it. They say no without explaining. They leave situations without dramatic exits. They choose rest over performance. From a Jungian lens, This is ethical alignment with the self. And when that alignment begins, the psyche relaxes, because it no longer has to shout to be heard. Loss also becomes unavoidable at this stage, not as punishment, as realignment. Some relationships fall away. Certain futures quietly dissolve. Old roles stop fitting. The difference is that the people who make it through don't cling. They grieve, and grief clears space. Jung understood that individuation always involves letting go, not of life, but of what no longer belongs to it. What leaves during awakening was already incompatible. The pace also changes. There is no rush, but there is no return. Decisions become fewer, but cleaner. Life stops feeling chaotic and starts feeling coherent. Not easier, truer. And something subtle happens when this coherence takes root. The need to explain disappears. They don't rush to name the process. They don't try to convince anyone. They don't perform insight. They embody it. And the world responds differently. Boundaries are respected without force. Misaligned situations dissolve on their own. Energy returns, not as excitement, but as stability. Jung believed the self expresses itself through being, not proclamation. That's why awakening, when integrated, becomes quieter, not louder, and that quiet is not emptiness. It's alignment. In the final section, I'll show you how to recognize whether this integration has already started in you. The signs that you're no longer just awakening, but actually crossing. There comes a moment when awakening stops feeling chaotic. Not because life becomes easy, but because something inside you becomes steady. You begin to notice that you no longer need to prove what you're going through. The urge to explain yourself fades. The need to be understood loses its urgency. You still feel deeply, but you react less. Silence becomes tolerable. Solitude feels intentional, not lonely. And uncertainty no longer feels like an emergency. You start trusting yourself in a new way. Not with confidence, with coherence. Decisions feel quieter, but firmer. You pause before responding. You choose fewer words, and mean them more. There's also a subtle emotional shift. You stop trying to fix yourself. The constant self-monitoring relaxes. The internal commentary softens. And instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What is this asking of me?" Jung believed this was a sign that the ego had stepped out of the way enough for the self to lead. Not loudly, gently. You also notice that some things simply no longer tempt you. Old dynamics don't hook you the same way. Certain distractions lose their grip. Validation doesn't feel necessary to move forward. Not because you're detached, but because you're aligned. And alignment creates a strange kind of peace. Not the absence of fear, but the absence of inner contradiction. This is how you know the crossing has begun. Before we close, I want to leave you with a moment of stillness. Not to analyze, not to fix, just to listen. Take a slow breath and ask yourself, not in your mind, but in your body, what can I no longer pretend is working? What part of me is asking for honesty instead of effort? And what is one small action today that would honor that truth? Don't rush the answer. The self doesn't speak in urgency. It speaks in resonance. If this video resonated, it doesn't mean you're late. It means you arrived exactly when you needed to. Awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about allowing what's false to fall away. And yes, most people retreat when that begins. But not because they are weak, because they've never been taught how to stay. If you're still here, still listening, you didn't miss the moment. You're in it. And in the next video, I'll talk about the rarest sign of all, The moment when life starts responding differently because the self has taken the lead. If you're crossing that threshold, leave a comment saying, "I'm crossing." And if this journey feels familiar, subscribe to Hidden Mind. You're not alone in it. You never were.